I was halfway through installing a new mailbox when I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels snapping against concrete like a metronome of doom. I turned just in time to see Meredith Caldwell marching straight toward me, clipboard clutched like a weapon, lips pursed so tight they could slice glass. I had only lived in this neighborhood for 3 months. Bought a cozy ranch-style house on a quiet cul-de-sac in a town called Pinebrook. The area was great, no HOA, no drama, or so I thought. "You there," she barked, stopping right at the edge of my driveway. "You can't have that mailbox, it's not HOA approved." I blinked. "Excuse me," she pointed to the black iron mailbox I was bolting in. "That design violates Pinebrook Green's HOA Code Section 4.10. You'll need to remove it immediately or face a fine." I stood up slowly, brushing dust off my jeans. "I don't live in Pinebrook Greens," her eyes narrowed. "Yes, you do. This entire street is under our jurisdiction." "No," I said, keeping my voice calm. "This house was built in the early 90s. The HOA was formed 5 years ago. This street was never annexed." Meredith's nostrils flared like a cartoon bull. "I'll be filing a lawsuit." "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." That was the moment I knew she wasn't just bluffing. She was serious, the kind of serious only overextended HOA presidents with too much time and too little power could be. "My name is Lucas Danner," I said. "And I'm not part of your HOA." She spun on her heels and stomped off. I watched her go, half expecting her to trip on her own rage. I figured it would blow over. But Meredith Caldwell wasn't the type to let something like facts get in the way of control. 3 days later, I was served papers. "Sued," I muttered, flipping through the ridiculous lawsuit. She claimed I was in violation of neighborhood appearance standards, that my presence created visual disharmony, and that I owed Pinebrook Greens HOA over $5,000 in fines and dues. I laughed. Then I got to work. I pulled the deed to my house, the property records from the county assessor, and the original HOA charter. My street, not listed. My house. Built 20 years before the HOA existed. I even found an old city zoning map confirming the HOA's boundaries stopped 2 blocks south. But I didn't stop there. I drove down to the county office and pulled the HOA's incorporation documents. Turns out they'd voted to expand their boundaries last year but never filed those changes with the county. Legally, their expansion never happened. That night I printed everything. Every map, every filing, every time-stamped document proving I wasn't under their jurisdiction. By the time we got to small claims court, Meredith looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. "You may proceed," the judge said, glancing at her stack of papers. "I'm representing Pinebrook Greens HOA," she announced, stepping forward in her pastel pink blazer. "Mr. Danner is in clear violation of our residential standards and has refused to comply." The judge turned to me. "Mr. Danner, your response?" "I have full documentation that proves my property is not within the HOA's legal boundaries," I said, sliding the folder across the bench. "In fact, the HOA attempted to annex my street without following proper legal procedure. Their jurisdiction ends 2 blocks south of my home. I've included zoning maps, assessor records, and the HOA's own charter showing the limits." The judge flipped through the documents. Meredith leaned forward, clearly trying to read them upside down. "This is very thorough," the judge said. "Miss Caldwell, did your HOA file a boundary amendment with the county?" She hesitated, then said, "We voted on it." "That's not what I asked." "No," she mumbled. "Then Mr. Danner is not and has never been under your HOA's authority." "Case dismissed." Meredith opened her mouth to argue, but the judge raised a hand. "And I suggest you refrain from filing lawsuits without verifying your facts. Any future harassment could lead to legal consequences." 3 minutes. That's all it took to shut her down. I walked out of that courtroom with my papers in hand and a grin I couldn't hide. But Meredith Caldwell wasn't done with me yet. And I had a feeling things were about to get worse before they got better. By the time I got home from the courthouse, 2 things were waiting for me. First, a letter duct taped to my garage. The paper was crumpled, the handwriting tight and slanted with fury. It read like a ransom note penned by someone who just lost a chess match and couldn't accept it. No signature, but it didn't need one. It reeked of Meredith. Second, a pair of unfamiliar SUVs parked across the street, both facing my house. Windows tinted. Engines off. No one got out. I didn't like either of those things, but I wasn't going to play defense. I'd already learned Meredith didn't quit when she lost. She doubled down. And I intended to be 5 steps ahead. The next morning, I stopped by the building department. I asked the clerk, a guy named Raj with an encyclopedic knowledge of local ordinances, if there had been any new filings for my area. He pulled up a queue of recent permits and notices, then paused. "You might want to see this," he said, tilting the screen. There it was. A request filed 2 days ago by Pinebrook Greens HOA to impose a new beautification buffer zone stretching beyond their official border right through my street. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. They were trying to backdoor their way into regulating properties they had no legal right to touch. Raj leaned closer. "Thing is, that kind of zoning change has to be reviewed by the Planning Commission, and they'd need a public comment period. But this one's marked expedited." "That's unusual." "Who signed off on the expedited review?" He clicked a few times, then frowned. "One of the assistant city attorneys, last name Winthrop." That name rang a bell. I pulled out my phone and searched the last zoning meeting minutes. There he was, James Winthrop. A former HOA board member for Pinebrook Greens, now quietly working at City Hall. This wasn't just Meredith anymore. She had allies inside the system. I thanked Raj, took a screenshot of the permit request, and headed straight for Council Member Valdez's office. He represented our district and was known for being a stickler for due process. I'd met him once at a neighborhood cleanup event and remembered he'd served in the Navy before getting into local politics. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Tasha, let me in after I explained why I was there. I laid out the zoning request, the expedited approval, and the conflict of interest with Winthrop. Valdez studied the documents in silence, then leaned back in his chair. "They're trying to create a paper trail," he said. "Even if it's illegal, if no one stops it, it becomes precedent." "You think they're planning to enforce it?" "They already tried. I've got a letter duct taped to my garage and mystery SUVs watching my place." He nodded. "I'll get this on the agenda for emergency review, but you'll need to show up and speak." "They won't just take my word for it. I'll be there." That night, around 11, I saw the same 2 SUVs drive past again, this time slower. One of them paused at the corner, and a camera flash popped from the passenger side window. I walked out with my phone in hand and snapped a photo of their plates. They sped off, tires squealing. I filed a police report the next morning. Officer Daniels, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a no-nonsense attitude, took it seriously. "You said this started after a court case," Small claims. "I beat an HOA president trying to illegally enforce rules on my property." He scribbled notes. "Same HOA connected to the zoning change request." "Yeah, and I've got evidence showing their lawyer pushed it through without proper review." Daniels tapped his pen against the clipboard. "That makes this more than harassment. If they're using intimidation tactics and abusing city channels to retaliate, that's criminal. I'll loop in our special investigations unit." By the time the Planning Commission meeting came around, the council chamber was packed. Meredith sat dead center, surrounded by a flock of HOA board members in matching green polos. They whispered among themselves like a pack of vultures waiting for a rabbit to limp. Council Member Valdez opened the floor. "We're here to review the expedited zoning request filed by Pinebrook Greens HOA. Mr. Danner, you've requested to speak." I stepped up to the mic, clicked the small remote in my hand, and brought up my slides. "This zoning request is not just improper, it's dangerous. It was filed without notifying affected residents, expedited by a former Pinebrook board member currently working in the city attorney's office, and designed to target properties outside the HOA's jurisdiction." I displayed the original HOA charter, the zoning map, and the conflict of interest documentation. Then I showed a timeline of the SUV surveillance, the harassing letter, and the police report number tied to the investigation. I'm not just asking you to deny this request. I'm asking you to investigate the individuals involved in pushing it through. A low murmur swept through the room. Meredith's face had gone pale. The commission voted unanimously to reject the zoning request. But that wasn't the end. The city launched an internal audit the following week. Turns out, Winthrop had expedited 3 other requests from different HOAs, each time bypassing public input and rubber-stamping boundary extensions. All of them were linked to neighborhoods with declining membership and shrinking budgets. The audit findings were leaked to a local paper. The headline read, "City Attorney Tied to HOA Power Grab Scheme." Within days, Winthrop was placed on administrative leave pending ethics violations. And Meredith, well, that's when the real fun began. Turns out, one of the HOA board members, Gregory Hensley, had resigned quietly 2 months prior. I tracked him down through a mutual contact in city planning. He agreed to meet at a diner on the edge of town. "I knew it was shady," he said over a plate of fries. Meredith kept pushing for expansion. Said we needed more dues-paying properties to stabilize the budget. But when I asked to see the financials, she shut me out. "You think there's money missing?" I'd bet my pension on it. She's been authorizing repairs that never happened, landscaping contracts with companies that don't exist. It's all run through one management firm, Mason Property Solutions. I checked. That company's registered to her cousin in Arizona. That was the moment it all clicked. Meredith wasn't just power-hungry. She was embezzling. I turned everything over to Officer Daniels, who looped in financial crimes. Within a week, the HOA's records were subpoenaed. The forensic audit that followed uncovered over $70,000 in misappropriated funds, bogus invoices, and suspicious cash withdrawals. Meredith was arrested on 6 counts of fraud, falsifying financial records, and attempted extortion. Her face was on the evening news, being led from her house in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. The HOA collapsed within a month. Most of the board resigned. Residents called an emergency meeting to dissolve the organization entirely. Council member Valdez co-sponsored a bill to increase oversight of all HOAs in the county. It passed with overwhelming support. As for me, I replaced the mailbox Meredith tried to ban with a custom one shaped like a miniature courthouse. Every time I checked the mail, it reminded me, some people try to build power. Others build justice. The morning after Meredith's arrest, I stood at my kitchen window watching a city maintenance crew remove the Pinebrook Greens HOA sign from the intersection. The bolts squealed as the last rusted plate came free. It dropped into the truck bed with a clang that echoed down the cul-de-sac like a bell marking the end of a reign. I should have felt satisfied, but something didn't sit right. The deeper I thought about it, the more I realized the fraud charges were just the tip of what Meredith had been orchestrating. The HOA's collapse had come too fast, and the city's audit only scraped the surface. There were still pieces missing. I started by going through the public records for the HOA's dissolved LLC. The address listed for their management office, Mason Property Solutions, was a P.O. box in a strip mall nearly 40 minutes out of town, tucked between a closed-down laundromat and a pawn shop. I drove out there on a hunch. The box was empty, but a clerk inside the postal annex pointed me toward the leasing company that handled the strip mall. According to them, the box had been rented under an alias. C. Maynard. I pulled the business registration. The signature? Cheryl Maynard Caldwell, Meredith's mother. Back home, I compiled everything into a timeline: payments, board meeting decisions, zoning requests, even neighborhood complaints. I was looking for patterns. That's when I noticed something odd. Over the past year, 23 residents had either sold or been forced to list their homes. Most cited increasing fines, harassment, or non-compliance penalties as the reason. And guess who had purchased at least 9 of those homes at auction? A shell company called Larchwood Equity Group, recently registered under a trust traced to a law firm in Phoenix. I got in touch with a woman named Denise who used to live on the far side of Pinebrook Greens. Her house had been foreclosed 6 months earlier. When I asked her what happened, her voice trembled. I had a shed in the backyard that was 5 feet too close to the fence, according to them. They fined me every week until it was over $12,000. I couldn't pay it. They put a lien on my house. When I tried to challenge it, they accused me of violating board meeting decorum and suspended my voting privileges. Did you ever meet anyone from Larchwood? Only once. A guy came to the door a week before the auction and offered to help me out if I signed a quick claim deed. I said no. 2 weeks later, the foreclosure went through. I asked her to send me any documents she had. By nightfall, my inbox was full of scanned letters, notices, and one grainy photo of a man in a charcoal suit holding a folder face partially turned, but familiar. I ran the image through a facial recognition plugin I'd tinkered with during my stint consulting for a cybersecurity firm. The result came back with 93% certainty. Dennis Halpern, real estate investor formerly sanctioned in Nevada for coercive property acquisitions. I brought it all to Officer Daniels. He read through the folder slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. This isn't just fraud. This qualifies as racketeering. If that shell company acquired properties through coordinated harassment and manufactured violations, that's a pattern of criminal enterprise. He excused himself to make a call. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room with 2 federal agents from the local FBI field office. They'd already been investigating Halpern on separate charges and were stunned to find his fingerprints buried in an HOA scandal. "This explains the sudden property acquisitions," one of them said. "He's been using local organizations as leverage points: HOAs, housing trusts, even community foundations. But this is the first time we've seen direct misuse of municipal zoning channels. They asked me to stay quiet about the ongoing investigation. My role for now was to gather testimony and connect them with other residents who'd been affected. Over the next 2 weeks, I did just that. I met with a retired schoolteacher who'd been fined for having wind chimes exceeding acceptable decibel levels. A single mother who was cited for her kids' chalk drawings on the driveway. A veteran fined for flying a flag on a pole that wasn't HOA approved in height. Every story followed the same path: escalating penalties, liens, then foreclosure threats. What they didn't know was that Meredith had been receiving kickbacks from Halpern's firm. The payments were cleverly disguised as consulting fees and funneled through a second shell company registered in Arizona. The FBI's forensic team traced the wire transfers, and suddenly, the full picture came into view. Meredith wasn't just running a corrupt HOA. She was a cog in a regional scheme to strip homeowners of equity and flip their properties for profit. The next domino fell when the city attorney's office quietly suspended James Winthrop pending a grand jury review. His expedited zoning changes had been part of a broader pattern. In exchange for pushing through boundary expansions, he received campaign contributions and a promise of partnership in a private planning firm Halpern was launching. The county district attorney announced the investigation during a press conference. The charges ranged from wire fraud to public corruption. Meredith's bail was revoked. Halpern was arrested in Scottsdale. Winthrop lawyered up. Meanwhile, I was asked to testify before the county oversight committee. The room was packed: press, residents, council members. This time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was representing every homeowner who'd been manipulated into silence. I stepped up to the microphone, documents in hand, and faced the panel. "You've seen the evidence," I began, "but this isn't just about money, it's about trust. These people, Meredith Caldwell, Dennis Halpern, James Winthrop, they didn't just exploit legal loopholes. They weaponized bureaucracy. They made ordinary families believe they had no choice but to surrender their homes. And they did it under the guise of community standards. The silence in the room was almost reverent. They didn't just break the law, they broke the backbone of this neighborhood. And unless we create safeguards, real ones, it will happen again. The committee passed a motion that evening to establish a countywide HOA accountability board with subpoena power, resident representation, and mandatory audits for all associations operating within city limits. The motion passed unanimously. Back on my street, things changed fast. The neighborhood, no longer under the shadow of the HOA, came alive in ways I hadn't expected. People painted their mailboxes however they wanted. Kids chalked the sidewalks freely. Neighbors who'd barely spoken before now gathered on driveways, trading stories and helping each other with repairs. One Saturday afternoon, Denise showed up with lemonade and a stack of thank you cards from former residents who'd lost their homes and were now part of the class action suit against Halpern's network. "You started something," she said. "You didn't just stop them. You gave people their voice back." I looked around at the cul-de-sac, the same one that had once been stalked by SUVs and clipboard tyrants. Now it was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue drifting from backyard grills. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been reclaimed. 2 months after the County Oversight Committee passed reforms, I got a call from a name I hadn't heard before. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maribel Grant. She introduced herself quickly, said she'd been looped into the federal case following the municipal corruption charges, and wanted to meet in person. I agreed, and the next day we sat across from each other in a quiet conference room on the second floor of the federal building downtown. "I've reviewed your testimony," she said, laying a thick file on the table between us. "You did more than expose a corrupt HOA. You cracked open a real estate laundering operation that may stretch across 3 states. I didn't say anything right away. Her tone was clipped, matter of fact, but her eyes were studying me like she was still deciding whether I was just lucky or someone worth recruiting. "Here's what we know so far," she continued. "Meredith Caldwell and Dennis Halpern weren't just targeting homeowners in Pinebrook. There are 2 other HOAs in neighboring counties where we've found similar patterns: rapid annexation attempts, unexplained fee hikes, property seizures, and bulk purchases through Larchwood Equities aliases." I nodded slowly. "So Pinebrook was a test run." "Exactly." "And you shut it down before they scaled it statewide." She pushed the file toward me. Inside were documents marked confidential bank transfers linking Halpern's shell companies to out-of-state trusts, communications between HOA board members discussing compliance escalations, and internal memos from Winthrop's office suggesting deliberate manipulation of zoning review protocols. Maribel tapped a finger on one document. "We're preparing a RICO case, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. But here's the catch. Some of the victims are being threatened into silence. We need a public face for the civil action. Someone who already stood up to them and won." I leaned back. "You want me to lead a class action, not lead, anchor. You're already the reason this came to light. With your case at the center, we can show a clear pattern of coercion, fraud, and abuse of authority." I agreed, and over the next several weeks my life turned into a blur of depositions, strategy meetings, and late-night calls from attorneys building the case. More residents stepped forward, some from neighborhoods I'd never heard of, people who thought they were alone until they saw the news coverage. One man from over in Millstone Hollow described being fined for untrimmed hedges until he lost his home. Another, a retired firefighter, had been cited for parking his truck at an angle inconsistent with community standards. Each new story made the pattern clearer. Meanwhile, Meredith was still in jail, denied bail after investigators discovered she'd attempted to wire funds to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Her cousin, the one fronting Mason Property Solutions, lawyered up, but eventually flipped, handing over emails that proved Meredith had coordinated directly with Halpern on property seizures in exchange for kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. But the biggest break came from an unlikely source. A former paralegal named Cindy who had briefly worked for Halpern's Phoenix law office. She sent a letter to the Department of Justice outlining how she'd been instructed to falsify compliance letters and backdate fine notices used to justify foreclosures. When they pressed her for proof, she produced archived email chains and a USB drive with document drafts, including one that still had metadata showing it had been created weeks after the supposed violation date. That was the smoking gun. With that evidence, the RICO charges moved forward. A federal grand jury handed down indictments not just for Halpern and Meredith, but for 6 others tied to the scheme, including a notary who had forged signatures on property transfer documents, and a real estate broker who knowingly facilitated the sales of illegally seized homes. The trial date was set for early spring. I was called to testify on the 3rd day. The courtroom was packed press in the gallery, victims lining the benches, and the entire front row occupied by federal prosecutors. The defense tried to paint me as disgruntled, claiming I had a personal vendetta against the HOA. But the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance photos, email logs, bank records, zoning whistleblowers, and a map that showed just how methodically each expansion attempt had been orchestrated. I walked the jury through my story how Meredith had shown up uninvited, claimed authority she didn't have, sued me for non-compliance, and how that led to the discovery of the entire network. When I stepped down, I caught a glimpse of Halpern at the defense table. He wasn't cocky anymore. He looked hollow. Like a man who had finally run out of strings to pull, the verdict came back in under a week, guilty on every count. The court sentenced Halpern to 18 years in federal prison without parole. Meredith got 12. Winthrop, after cooperating late in the investigation, received 5 years and a permanent disbarment. The rest received sentences ranging from probation to 7 years, depending on their level of involvement. But the real win wasn't in the prison terms. It came 6 weeks after the trial, when the judge approved a restitution fund drawn from the seized assets of Halpern's companies. Over 30 families would receive compensation for their losses, enough to help some of them buy homes again, return to their communities, or finally pay off the debts that had been forced onto them. Council Member Valdez invited me to the unveiling of the new Neighborhood Integrity Office, funded in part by a federal grant and designed to monitor HOA behavior countywide. They even created a hotline for residents to report abuse anonymously. Tasha, Valdez's assistant, handed me a framed document. It was a letter of recognition signed by the county board, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the DOJ task force for safeguarding the rights of homeowners and exposing systemic abuse within unregulated neighborhood associations. I didn't hang it in my house. I gave it to Denise. She put it up in the community center a few blocks over, where most of the former Pinebrook Greens residents now met regularly for game nights, potlucks, and town halls. The old HOA sign never went back up. The pole sat empty for a while until someone no one will admit who bolted on a custom steel plaque that read, "Community, not control." It stayed there, untouched, like a quiet promise. I never heard from Meredith again. But about 6 months later, I did receive a letter from one of the homeowners who had testified in the federal case, a woman from Millstone Hollow. She just closed on a new home, no HOA, plenty of yard space, and a porch where her grandkids could play. At the bottom of the letter, she'd written just one sentence: "They don't own us anymore." And that, more than anything else, was the ending we all deserved.